Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Imagine you're in a field at the Glastonbury Festival in 1987, and as the sun rises, you see silhouetted a familiar sight. Is it Stonehenge? Ancient stones hauled across the Salisbury plain? No, it's Carhenge, a circle of upright cars, their chassis standing like monoliths, the archaeology of the automobile age, arranged in a ritual landscape. Or imagine you're in Berlin, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there you see Tankhenge, a gateway made from abandoned Soviet tanks, and a Soviet jet pointing at the Reichstag, the wreckage of the Cold War, turned into a piece of anarchic sculpture. Or perhaps you're at Burning Man Festival in Nevada more recently, and there's a strange mechanical creature, a huge moving monster, crawling across the desert, assembled from engines, scrap metal, and the discarded parts of machines. These strange and spectacular visions all come from the same source, the Mutoid Waste Company, a collective that since the early 80s has been transforming the debris of industrial civilization into giant sculptures, mutant vehicles, and temporary worlds built from waste. And at the centre of it all is the artist Joe Rush, the main creative force behind the Mutoids, and I'd say one of the most distinctive figures in British countercultural art. And in this episode of The Bureau, we begin a conversation that traces Joe's story from his childhood to his emergence as an artist and the leader of the Mutoid Waste Company. It's a story that begins with family, particularly the inventive spirit of his parents and an itinerant childhood spent moving from place to place in southern England. And it takes us into the world of late 1970s West London, the punk years around Portobello Road, the alternative communities and squats that were forming in the area, and Joe's time living in the autonomous neighbourhood known as Frestonia. And it was there, amongst scrap materials, as we'll hear, Joe began experimenting with building art from recycled objects, welding together discarded fragments of modern life. This is the first part of my conversation with Joe, and if you're listening in March 2026, it coincides with the opening of his latest exhibition, Unnatural it's called. It's at the Bomb Factory in London. There's a link to it in the show notes. But for now, wherever you are, whenever you're listening, here he is, Joe Rush. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Joe.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You've got a very big story to tell. We're going to walk through your crazy life in times, I'd say. And I was thinking, how can I start this, given all the stuff that you've done? So I thought I'd actually start off with something that you said. You said, my principle's long been that if a child thinks a work of art is bollocks, it's probably no good. Kids can see through nonsense. And I try to remain a child in that sense. Some people think you need to grow up. You don't.
That's my excuse, yeah.
So I thought, why don't we actually go back to 1960 when you were born? You're actually a Londoner, one of those rare people who's actually born in London.
Yeah. I was born in a bedsit in Highgate in 1960. Parents are both art students at St Martin's from very diverse sort of backgrounds, really. You know, my mother, very bohemian, very poor but cultured people, you know, and her mother was a writer. She wrote The Borrowers, you know, the book about the tiny people who lived under the floor.
Mary Norton?
Mary Norton was my mother's mother, yes. Yeah,
that was your grandmother?
So they kind of, you know, so they were sort of a fading grandeur type side of the family. And my father's side were actually very normal people. His mother was from Bernardo's Homes. There was abandoned children. Her mother was last seen on Waterloo Station wrapped in newspapers.
Ouch.
And so she never saw her brothers and sisters again. But she had a real wild side to her, and it came through in my dad, who had this fantastic creative ability which had no history in his family at all, you know, where you could...
He was like a portrait artist, right?
He was a portrait sketcher on Hastings Beach when we were kids to sort of live, you know. He set up his stall and that. He developed the whole technique in paper mache, of doing portraits in paper mache. His whole life was creative. He was terrible with money.
So you're born in a bedsit in Highgate, so that sounds quite tough. You got brothers and sisters?
I've got an older sister. Someone told my mother she couldn't get pregnant when she was breastfeeding, and that's why I came along a year after my sister,
Right.
and I've got a younger brother, Sam, on that part of the family. That family only stayed together till I was about 4. And, my dad drove a woman to the railway station on his motorbike and didn't come back. That was the end of that part of the family.
Hold on a sec. Explain that a bit.
He took a family friend, a very beautiful woman called Jane, to the station on his motorbike, and they'd missed the train, so he drove her up to London, didn't come back.
What, fell in love and that was it?
We were in a place called Cotterid, a little village, in a little house, and left my mum completely in the lurch because we didn't have any money. She didn't own the house. She had 3 kids to look after.
So you'd moved from Highgate to out of London?
What it was my mother came from this very bohemian family, where writers and artists and playwrights, but also completely chaotic. So she was kind of looking for a bit of security, and my dad came from a very straight, low middle class family and was looking for the excitement. Kind of they crossed over, they met in the middle at St Martin's Art School, but they were definitely going in different directions. So that's kind of why that happened. But, they were brave enough and intelligent enough to remain friends, and to stop it turning nasty. We did have them both at different times,
Right, and then you'd grown up outside London at that time?
Yeah, I had a great aunt called Shear who I stayed with when the family broke up, and she knew the local vicar, and the local vicar had a vicarage house which he didn't use because he had his own house. So he, being a real Christian, let us have the house. So we lived in this little village in this old vicarage house. Eventually, my mother remarried, and then we all moved back up to Kew in West London, semi-detached house. For us, it was such a luxury, to have somewhere to live. And I was able to get on with turning into a nasty little London oik.
Just before we get into your life as an oik, when you were down in Hastings, you were seeing your dad doing these portraits. I mean, that's a classic thing, wasn't it, at that time? I mean, you probably still get it now, don't you, when people artists are fast enough to sort of do a life-like portrait.
Yeah, he could do it. He could do caricatures. He was very good at caricature. He had a little studio, which was an old glass-making studio in the old town at Hastings. We'd go down onto the seafront and he'd get this thing out that he used to stash between the fishing boats, which was a sort of fold-out screen that he'd made out of old church pews hinged together. And then he'd hang up all the pictures and put his table out and a chair for the person to sit on. And then us kids would try and sell the crowd drawings he'd done at Hastings, photocopied drawings of different views of Hastings, which were lovely drawings. And he would just sit there all day just drawing people. And,
amazing.
And we'd be running up and down the beach and going in the amusement arcades and just, it was a lovely life, really.
Have you got any of his drawings still? Or his
yeah. Because he also drew for a thing called Jack and Ori at the time, which was his TV thing they used to do every night of the week. Somebody would sit in his chair and read a book. They would carry 60 illustrations, like that. So he would do the illustrations for whatever book it was, like very fast style using sort of translucent inks. It was proper feast or famine because he'd have to get these 60 drawings out, so he'd sit there really bad tempered, just drawing, and we'd all sort of crawl around him because it was like an unexploded bomb. By that point we wouldn't have any money. He'd have spent all the advance, and it was really a big push to the end, like artists always. And then we would get on the train and we'd be gluing them all down to boards on the train. Then we'd get up here in Soho and go down to where they photographed them all. And then we'd be waiting for the check. It's a long way for the check. And then suddenly the check would arrive and we'd all party and,
Your dad's mood would suddenly lighten a lot. He handed it all in.
Yeah, no, exactly. He was a lovely dad to have because he could make everything for you, and he'd just take an old stick and a chicken bone and a bit of string and you'd wrap it all up, and next thing you know, this brilliant sword, that was better than any of the other kids had, it swings and roundabouts.
I mean, it's a sort of obvious thing to say, isn't it? But given what you've done as an artist and in terms of making stuff from anything, that must have been an early signpost somehow, right?
It definitely was, but it didn't actually occur to me that I was going to end up being an artist. And I kind of came about it my own way.
When we're kids in particular, and you model your parents without realising it in some ways.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
yeah.
Do you think it might have gone in?
Definitely. It's to see an artist, how they work, and that becomes normal to you. And my mother was a writer, so my mother was writing me children's books in the evenings, and that was kind of how we lived on that side. Also, with my grandmother sort of feeling the creativity, it was acceptable to be creative. Probably the most important thing about it was that my dad, he is one who had to fight against a very normal background to be this quite extreme character and to go down this path that he did. And because he normalised it, That was our starting point, whereas we didn't have to go through the fight. We didn't have to fight against parents who were objecting to it. We didn't have to break the mould in any way.
Even though skin of the teeth at times, financially or something, but it sounds like quite a free...
It was. The one thing we were brought up on both sides of the family was that we were never expected to do anything particular. Nobody was pushing to have us at university or to be a doctor. The only thing that would have been unacceptable would to be do something that was selfish or cheap or greedy. Without that, we were kind of left to find out what we wanted to do.
Those values of like not being greedy, not being selfish, that was sort of inherent in them in some way, was it?
Yeah, it was by nature, and by upbringing. They were slightly before the hippie thing. I suppose it was beatnik at my dad's time, but
yeah.
But even when that was all going off, when they tried to get him into the army because they were doing conscription, he actually had quite long hair then, and he didn't want to cut his hair, so he went to Canada with my mother just to get away from the conscription, and came back when my sister was born. So there was a lot of upheaval and never much money going around, but it was a wealth of encouragement and a wealth of love. So I feel, in a way, quite privileged for that upbringing.
When you got back to Kew, which is sort of outskirts of London for anybody who doesn't know the geography of it, you could be an oik. So how old were you then?
That went through from about 7 to 11.
So late 60s, basically. Were you aware then of the kind of amazing things that were going on in the culture? Because you're a bit young, probably, weren't you? But I mean, it's this is you got the hippies, you got the beatniks, then you got the hippies. It's kicking off in London, wasn't it? Like, I know that places in the country, but around the world as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, there was two major things going on there. So there was that, Hastings, a lot of artists in that town. So there was always people around, and he was never a smoker or anything. My dad, he never took acid. We always, we had Hendrix playing all the time, and Mad Dogs and Englishman Joe Cocker playing, and my stepfather introduced me to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Elvis and then Chuck Berry and all of that. So I got all the rock and roll stuff through that. But then the other thing that was going on at the time was imminent nuclear Armageddon, which was really quite real in those days. So when I was at 5, I went to school, and there was this kid, and he came up and told me that there were these people and they had these bombs, and we wouldn't even know they were coming in. They were going to blow up everything, including our houses. So I, told him he was a liar, and went home and asked my mum, and she said, no, it's true. So we sort of kind of had to learn to live underneath.
Shadow of the atom bomb, basically.
Yeah, basically, about imminent nuclear war, which was very much in the air at the time, which led to my mother and stepfather deciding to leave London. They'd found this tiny little farm, little mill farm down at the bottom of a lane, and a little house, and it was so old-fashioned. It was like something out of the century before. It had one electric light hanging on a cable in the front room. That was about it. And they decided to sell up and do the sort of good life thing and go and try and make this little farm work. So over that summer holiday, instead of going to the grammar school in London I was going to go to, we moved down to this farm, and my stepfather came back from the city of London, where he was working on the Friday night, and on the Monday he was milking like 8 cows, and one of them had to stand on bricks because its teats were so long, and the place stunk, of cows, and for me it was just a horror story really. And my sister, we were just like looking at it, going, oh my God, there was no one near us, and the only people that were near us were farmers, and they were nice people, but in those days, it was generational thing. When it came to the haymaking, there was no one on the school bus except for me and my sister, because families all worked and did the field. So it was a very, very rural, very remote place. I tried to get involved with the farming, and because I realised that if I didn't get involved in it, there was nothing to do. So I tried it, but the fact is, some people are country people and some people are farming people, and I'm not. I'm a city person, and my sister Fanny's the same. Eventually she was the first one to bolt, and she went off to live with my dad at Hastings. And 13 I managed to escape, and I got to my aunt who lived in Richmond, and this was really a fantastic time because she worked at the BBC World Service. Her husband had left, but she had my 3 cousins, and then she just had this funny old Georgian house that was, she couldn't afford to maintain it, so it was a mixture between this grandeur and their whole stair was missing, and it was just held up by the carpet, and there was a big phone box, where you put coins in the hallway. It was such a brilliant house. And she just took on all waifs and strays. On the top floor was my cousin Vicky and her boyfriend at the time, but turns to her husband, who was first generation skinhead. So he'd gone to an art school, and he drew Judge Dredd comics.
He was actually the artist for
They had different artists, but him and his friend Brendan McCarthy. And then he went on to start Deadline, which started Jamie Hewlett's career, So,
right, wow, okay.
So he was another artist so I could watch Fighting with the Deadlines, and he really introduced me to all these futuristic mutant ideas, because he was into mutants. And
so you were 13 at this time, right? Just before we talk about that, because that's obviously pivotal, but Joe, didn't you get quite ill for a while as well when you were a kid?
Every winter I would end up with bronchitis or asthma. Around Christmas time it would start. I'd start wheezing, I'd coughing, and then I was just in bed for a month.
What was that like?
My mother did the best she could to keep me entertained and stuff, but obviously I had long periods just on my own, and I think it was one of the things that really fired my imagination up, because I had to just create worlds and I had to create stories in my head.
Because you're isolated, so you basically threw them back on your own resources. End up living in your head quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're just constantly making up dreams and ideas and stories, and still part of my brain, which, while I'm talking to you, there's another part of my brain which is looking at all these shapes here, and which is the bit that I create sculptures with. But it's kind of autonomous, and I think maybe that got developed in that period. But it got to the point where just before I left the farm, I started to get coughing and wheezing, but I just decided I wasn't going to let it happen. And I found some of the old pills from the year before, and I didn't tell my mum, and I just started taking those, and it came and then it went, and then I didn't get ill, and I've never got ill since. So I maybe defeated it.
At one point, didn't you go on the road with your dad?
Yes,
and sort of live in a van and all that?
Well, what it was, we went down one summer, to stay with my dad. And instead of going to the studio, we got on a bus and we went to the outskirts of Hastings onto this farm. He'd found this proper traditional Victorian gypsy wagon, in this field, and he'd kind of done it up. He'd got the polystyrene from packing crates, and he'd cut it with a Stanley knife, cut all these prancing horses and bunches of grapes, and then painted them and glued them onto to anywhere where the wood was rotting. And it just ended up looking like the most beautiful gypsy cart ever hit the road. And he had all the pots and pans hanging under the axles, kettle on the chain, and we lived outside basically, cook it on the fire, because they're very small inside those things. You didn't really live in them like caravans. They just had beds, his and his girlfriend's bed, and then little drawers underneath the kids slept where we slept. And we had a upright paraffin heater where we boiled water on when it was raining, and we just set off from Hastings.
That seems quite significant as well, just them thinking ahead again, bearing in mind what we're going to come to with the peace convoy, the so-called New Age travellers, being on the road in rural England and also mixing with those other traveller communities, right?
We were always kind of outsiders. The feeling of freedom and the feeling of excitement, travelling, and we'd see some kids, we'd jump off the truck, go off and play with them, and then, it was getting dark, and we could find where the trailer had been by the marks in the road, so we'd just follow them. And it would either be outside a pub, and my dad would be in the pub, or it'd be in a field, and he'd have the fire set up, and we'd be boiling the water, and we'd be having our supper out in the fields. It gave me a feeling for travelling, which I've never lost, And even when I am static for a long period of time, my mentality is always one of being ready to move at any point,
How did it end, that trip?
We ended up on this place called the Figsbury Ring, which is an Iron Age fortress. As you're coming into Salisbury, and we ended up parking on there. Then my dad built a house out of hay bales and corrugated iron, and we lived in that, which they had this sort of tunnel you crawled down between to get in there.
So exciting though.
And then all our lighting was paraffin lamps. Can you imagine sitting
health and safety nightmare.
Yeah, totally. We didn't even think about it. It was just all part of the adventure, really. And I just remember the mornings. You're going out in the mist and this ancient. You could feel the ancient earthworks and. It's that feeling of being free, Then my dad got run over, basically. He was coming back from the pub, walking down the lanes, and someone hit and ran him.
Hit by a vehicle?
Yeah, hit by a vehicle who didn't stop. So what you also learned as a traveller was, people hate you. You bump into the prejudice. We're not gypsies, but we didn't half look like gypsies. My dad's got long black hair, a great big nose, very, very handsome, striking man, and his girlfriend was Italian with black curly hair, and us kids.
Feral.
So basically, I had a bag full of all my clothes when we set off, and my dad picked me up at Charing Cross Station, and I dropped the bag down the side of the train. It was either miss the train and pick the bag up, and he just said, no, I'll come back for it. He threw me on the train, and we never came back. So I spent the entire summer in a pair of tennis shorts and elastic waist, And the jersey my mother had made me, which had started to peel at the bottom, unpeel. A few weeks on the road, that was just 2 arms and a collar, and you could see my nipples, it was just like, and even the gypsy kids thought we were a bit rough, really. But,
yeah, so you're running into the sort of burghers of sort of rural England, and they're like, who are these lot? But you don't think there's any sort of malevolence in, like, that hit and run thing with your dad?
I would think so, yeah.
You think there was?
Yeah,
right.
I would
okay.
think so. Saw him in the dark and just thought, right, bang, got you, gypsy bugger,
Right. Gosh,
it's a pretty rough old world out there when you're travellers. Even if you're New Age travellers, if you're gypsy travellers, you're just constantly living in prejudice. And you'd see people who who call themselves Christians who would refuse to give you water. Or
right,
would call the police as soon as you turn up.
Yeah,
you kind of got a feeling for it of being an outsider, what it must be like and what it is like for these people who are born into these communities and they have it all their time, all their life,
Again, later on, that's going to become very significant in terms of like the beanfield and all the events around that, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Although, because we've covered the beanfield here before, and the one of the positive things about that whole thing is that it wasn't all the local community who were like prejudiced. Some people, including an aristocrat, actually sort of helped out and said, this is outrageous, you can't treat people like that, right? Mixed bag as ever, right, isn't it?
And it happens also with any sort of itinerant community or any sort of immigrant community, is you get to the point where you're meeting so much suspicion from people that you start to be like that with them,
Right.
They call you this and you call them that, and that kind of then justifies you to start robbing them, for a bit of diesel here and there, and
right.
And then you're the thieving gypsies, and then and they're the straights, and that's how these things kind of divide.
It becomes quite tribal then, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. As a traveller, you kind of use that to justify being a bit outrageous, I reckon. A lot of
you guys were living outside mainstream society, weren't you?
Yeah.
So, and also, I'm guessing that, given what you talk about with your dad, and also getting reception like that locally, probably with not that great fondness for mainstream society and the rules and regulations of ordinary life, right?
No, I think not. And I'm still much the same feeling about that. See, I was such a rebel at school. I got expelled from this grammar school I went to. But it also, in retrospect, it gave me an education to understand why I was rebelling. So
let's skip back to you come to London. You're sort of staying with your aunt in this crazy house, and your cousins upstairs, and then you said that you met this guy. You said he was a skinhead, right? The original skinheads, right?
Yeah, they were the first generation skinheads. Actually, it's kind of how Judge Dredd got called Judge Dredd, because it came from a Prince Buster song on, it's like,
right.
So there were a lot of those early 2000 AD artists were skinheads, Mike Mahone and people. They came out of that culture, and that ska reggae culture. And
that's interesting. I didn't know that at all. Yeah. Let's set the scene a bit though for anybody who doesn't know about 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and that whole world, which again, in terms of what you went on to do is very significant.
See, the comic was kind of the antithesis of the American squeaky clean superhero comic, and it was really dystopian worlds, and it was really talking about messed up futures. There was a character called Rogue Trooper, and he was always on toxic places where they've fought wars, and they were these genetically mutated warriors, who could live in this pollution. And then there's Judge Dredd, and they live in these crazy cities, where the whole of the outside of it is called the Cursed Earth, where it's all nuclear waste and mutants, popping up. Massively overcrowded cities, but had a real funny sort of English humour that went through. But it was the ideas that were in there, a lot of them have come to pass now. A lot of these things that they were dreaming up, as science fiction always does. Maybe even causes them to happen. I don't know, but
so that's somehow post-apocalyptic, but sort of ironic world, and given that background of living in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, there was this kind of doomy sense, and maybe it did die down a bit by the 70s. Oh, probably not actually.
No, it carried right on until the fall of the Berlin Wall, really.
Yeah, it did. For you, that's all in the background as well, isn't it? And because the impression I get, we've spoken about it here many times, is that the 60s, which always my imagination is this sort of sunny swinging place, but then it hits the 70s and it gets a lot darker, like the British society's on the rocks a bit. Unemployment, inflation. You've got all this stuff going on where social problems have suddenly come to the fore, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
Were you aware of that? Was London like at the time?
It was poor, I mean, the 60s were quite poor as well, it was...
But maybe optimistic, though.
The 60s was optimistic, and there was a human dream, that humanity was progressing, was going to break out. It was going to overcome the stupid people and build a new society. But what we didn't take into account was that a whole nother generation of stupid people were waiting to be born, and you can't just get rid of one. And it kind of went right on through British society, was that where we kind of thought all we had to do was have a great party and loads of fun and treat each other nicely, and somehow this was going to just manifest. We didn't engage politically enough, I don't think, and we're paying for it now.
It was quite a ferment in that time, wasn't it? And tell us a little bit about that and meeting this guy as an artist for 2000 AD, and then how did that seem to affect you in terms of what you were thinking about and imagining?
Well, I was always loved science fiction, so I already had a really head full of ideas about these sort of futuristic worlds, and but also at the same time, if you think about it, was punk rock was starting to grow,
right.
And that was a product of what you were saying was the end of the hippie dream, and this darker attitude, like a nihilistic attitude, but also do-it-yourself attitude, and this was how people were feeling at the time. Make your own music, to make your own clothes, Vivienne Westwood, so important in all of that, and it was just there for me, really. And I eventually got thrown out of school for being a proper scallywag and refusing to admit to it. My aunt had kicked me out as well, but my dad he'd been lent a house, or we'd never met the person who owned a house. He was an army colonel somewhere up in Scotland, and we ended up just using that for years. Didn't pay him any rent or anything. My sister was there, and and it was a really lovely, fun place to live. Didn't have any heating, didn't have any hot water, but had this great big overgrown garden with a car in it that the tree had grown right the way through, And I just stepped out of school in '76, and punk was there for me, and I was just made to be a punk, The people who had invented it, people like Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon, and they were a little bit older than me, and they had actually created it. But my generation was there to be it. I had a friend called Doug, whose dad was a bus driver, and we had these free tickets that we could get on the tube and travel to London. So we used to come up to the West End. He took me to the Vortex Club. It's in Wardour Street, I think, and these little grimy clubs. I think the first band I saw was the Adverts, and then X-Ray Specs, and it was just made for me. I was so happy there, and started making my own clothes. And
did you?
Yeah, everyone did.
Going to the market, so, and then adapting stuff and cutting out bricolage and
yeah, exactly. I've got blazers, and then I wrote on the back, I am an antichrist, I am an anarchist. I don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy the passer-by because I want to be, and right across my arse, anarchy, and all the chains from the local toilets, they were all strapped on, Wonder
what happened to all them.
That's the cause of absolute murders for people. You were the cutting edge of what was happening, but you were also X marks the spot for people having a pop at you, because you're a skinny little 16-year-old, and fully grown men battering the crap out of you, you know what I mean, or chasing you, and
for being a punk.
For being a punk, yeah. So if you were a punk in the 70s, you really had to be able to fight or flight. But any minute, you'd be at a bus stop, they'd be going, and 4 blokes would jump out and run this gauntlet of getting into, up into the West End. We had to cross at Hammersmith, and there was like 2 pubs full of teddy boys, like if you went in the toilet in the underpass and they caught you, you were done, and you had to hide in the toilet and keep the door shut.
That's so weird, isn't it? Like, because Max Desharnais came and he's written that book, Ted's, I mean, obviously about the original Teds.
Yeah.
This is sort of Teds Mark II, isn't it? But Teds versus punks, it's so strange, isn't it? Because the original Teds were a bit like punks, weren't they? I mean, okay, they had the hairdos and the Edwardian suits, but they were like working class street kids, weren't they? Right? Who were kicking over the previous generation of like like crooner music. So they were into Bill Haley and all that. And roll on 20 years, and they're actually battering the punk.
They weren't the same as the punks. They were much more misogynist than the punks. They were, they were kind of.
And a bit racist.
Really racist. Really.
We live in a time when, by its people on the right, London's being described as like this hellhole of crime and all this stuff, which is complete bullshit. Like there's less crime here now than there's been for a long time. But you hear about that, 70s. You've got the football violence.
Yeah.
So if you're a young punk, you're getting beat up and stuff like that. I mean, that just doesn't go on now.
You've got to bear in mind that by the time punk came up, police were actually wearing flares. Finally relented, and they're wearing these horrible sort of bri nylon flares that flared from the knee.
Sort of 5 years too late.
Yeah, exactly. And so, of course, if you just wore straight trousers, you were pretty much a target.
You're 16, going to clubs, listening to the music, making your own clothes, hanging out with your punk mate. What happens next?
And when I finally got expelled from school, my dad, who'd been sort of looking after me for a bit, and said, "Well, I've done my bit," which he hadn't really. And he I went off to Scotland where he was seeing this girl, and I went out on this Rock Against Racism march, with the Anti-Nazi League, and we all met up at Trafalgar Square, and 70,000 people, maybe more, I don't know. We marched from Trafalgar Square right the way down into the East End, and the Clash played in Victoria Park. This girl on the march came up and said, "Oh, your mum and my mum used to push us around in trams in Waterloo Park in Highgate when we were little, and I recognised you."
You hadn't changed very much, which is amazing.
She said, "Oh, we've got this squat in Portobello Road. Do you want to come up there and live there?" They just had the Notting Hill Carnival riot. I was thinking, God, if it's this bad where I am now, what's it going to be like up there? But in the end, I did. I got on the bus, came up with my few possessions, moved into an old stripped-out bathroom in this half-stripped-out house on Portobello Road. And I went out into the street. I met this bloke, and he went, "Do you want to get some puff?" I went, "Yeah, go on." And we went out, and there was like a load of rastas sitting out. It was like like a New York brownstone. They were all sitting out the front of this taxi rank, and we went in and scored a bit of puff. It was suddenly I realised that I was out of this pressure that I'd been living under, like I felt like I was floating. That was the first time I ever felt like I was at home somewhere, and I still, in my heart, I still feel that the Portobello Road is kind of my home, really. And so I stayed around that area.
I think it's important to say about Portobello, many people who are not from London or the UK probably know about for the market, which has been there forever and it's still going strong, antiques and all that stuff, but it had been a sort of countercultural place right the way through the 60s, hasn't it? And it remains some. Ladbroke Grove, the Westway. You mentioned the Clash already. They were from around there, and Hawkwind were based there.
Yeah, the Hawkwind were there. And
Michael Moorcock was based there.
That's right. Yeah.
Then you've got people like Heathcote Williams, International Times.
Yeah, you had this other thing called Bit.
Early sort of like almost like a countercultural Time Out, right? And
and it was the Overland to India thing. So a lot of hippies were doing that.
And then the Rough Tough Puff Estate Agency, which was a guide to how to squat a building. Where squats were, right? All.
And Rough Trade,
Rough Trade Records, and all in that sort of strip of West London, right? And then the West Indian community, so you've got a lot of reggae there as well, Don Letts, Notting Hill Carnival, all mixing up together in quite a small area. So many things happen on Ladbroke Grove. It's from the beatniks through the hippies, through the punks and post-punk and into rave even, right? And Spiral Tribe and all that.
Michael Moorcock, he's the Hawkwind people, were absolutely convinced that there was like these ley lines crossing over, right actually at the point where we were living in that squat, Cambridge Gardens. So there was all that culture in it. A lot of writers, and every Friday and Saturday you had all the second-hand market, all the fly pictures, so people just come and just throw a blanket on the thing and throw all their bits on it and try and make a few quid. But also in those days, if you think about it, we didn't have a communication system like you have now, right? So if you wanted to find out what was going to happen on Saturday night, you kind of had to go somewhere to find out. So it'd either be Portobello or it'd be Camden. Get in the pub at lunchtime and you'd see someone and they'd go, "Oh, there's a party going off over there, or this gig's going off over there." And the other alternative was to ring someone up on a payphone and just hope that they happened to be sitting close up to hear the phone, strapped to the wall, So
how were you surviving financially?
Most people survived on supplementary benefit, 30 or 40 quid a week, just to shut you up. And everyone used to go up to Lisson Grove, just off the Edgware Road, a huge great old office there. And basically line up, and you'd have to go on and sign this bit of paper. That's why it's called signing on. You'd have to sign this bit of paper saying that you'd been looking for work but you hadn't found any, and then they'd give you your little gyro, which you go and cash in the post office to get some cash. And it wasn't much, but it was enough to go to the cafe and eat and buy yourself 10 fags and pay off a couple of debts. But it was like the who's who of punk world. You look over there and there's a Clash all queuing up over there. You look over there, there's X-Ray Specs or Susie and the Banshees over there. Everyone basically doing it, and I think a lot of people have gone to art school, and the art schools are great breeding grounds of the music, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't get into an art school because my mother was too poor because the farm was making so little money, and my father didn't want to be anywhere near the tax man, so he didn't say anything. So I couldn't get in to any art school, and I'd been kicked out of art at 14 in my own school. So that was kind of one of the reasons why I didn't really think I was going to be an artist. But
were you actually doing stuff? I mean, were you making stuff? Whether or not you go into art school or doing an art level, but you've got this very artistic background and childhood and stuff. Were you drawing? And
I mean, I was massively influenced by my friend Brett, so I was trying to draw comics. But comic drawing is a whole thing. There's an awful lot of laborious work to do in it, and I didn't really have the patience for it. And then I made this helmet from an old ice hockey helmet, a load of plastic tubes, and I made this sort of Mohican type helmet, and I was quite pleased with myself really about that. But I had a really lucky thing happen to me there, which was that my sister started seeing this fellow called Steve Smithick, and he Liverpudlian, who family were like really tough, run a pub in Liverpool, like they were proper Scousers, but he kind of had escaped and gone to art school. Then he'd come down to London and was working in the film studios, because all West London was lots of film studios. And he ended up getting together with my sister and coming to live with us. And he started his own scenery studio in Richmond, and I just came down on my motorbike from Ladbroke Grove. And he goes, "Can you paint?" And I went, "Well, I don't know." He said, "Well, grab that paintbrush and start painting there. I'm late, And so I ended up painting these big scenery things, and it was for Doctor Who. That was being filmed in Television Centre in Shepherd's Bush. And then we ended up making these nuclear reactor things. It was the episode was about some sort of spaceship where the nuclear reactor had blown up. And
Right up your street.
Yeah, it was great, yeah. And we were just banging all them, sticking bits of carpet on to make it look like technology and bits of buttons and stuff. Yeah. And I worked 33 hours straight, and I never looked back. And I worked for him for like 5 years.
Making scenery and props.
Scenery and props. And I basically taught me mould making, painting, casting, woodwork. Very, very practical education, like carving, polystyrene carving. We used to do great cliff faces with hot wires and sculptures. So that was my art education. It wasn't going to an art school, but it was a really practical education. You just wanted to get things to look right. You didn't have this thing where you had to think about the meaning of it, or
And also, you had to work against the deadline, right?
Yeah, the art director would come in and do this little drawing on a back of a cigarette packet, and so you had to do a lot of the inventiveness about it. But you'd also have to say, whatever they said, "Can you make 200 rubber fish for a Benny Hill sketch?" And you go, "Yeah, of course we can do that," And then they'd go, and we'd think, "How are we going to do that?"
In terms of what you've done, that's so important, then, right? That sort of education and practical hands-on.
Practical hands-on, and also he taught me how to keep people you're working with happy, and how to be gracious to people, and make sure everyone's got their money and time, and just generally, he taught me how to lead, which turned out to be very useful as well later on. So,
is it true that you shaved your head at one point, went out, felt a bit exposed, so went back and stuck a rabbit's fur on your head? Is that true?
Yeah, that was true. That was it up in Ladbroke Grove. Yeah, just shave a head, and I went out, and I just felt kind of so vulnerable, like with this bald head, and everyone looking at me like I was, skinhead. Some people getting really scared and all that. So I went back in, and I rolled up this rabbit skin with a bit of double-sided carpet tape, stuck it on like a Mohican. Went out in the street. It was great because everyone reacted, but people who thought it was funny laughed. Some people thought it was really sexy. You know what I mean? Which some people were terrified by it. Basically, people reflected themselves in how they reacted to it. And I kind of thought, this is great. By the end of it, I'm walking around with rabbit skins tied all over me, bare feet, and carrying a spear, the mad man of Wonga. You know what I mean? And everyone's jumping out the way. And that kind of started me with what became the Mutoids, and then I was going to carve like this sort of futuristic Mohican out of polystyrene, like Rogue Trooper or something, but as I was carving it, I ended up carving it into a banana, and I just glued that on my head like a Mohican, and then I went out in the street with this banana on, and that really got a reaction. That was really funny. And the police just couldn't handle it. The police just used to get, literally stand off the pavement and let me walk past because in their minds,
you're not actually breaking the law by wearing a banana on your head, are you?
But
just completely bamboozled them.
Yeah, it did, and they didn't know how to deal with it. But other people would just laugh. So old black guy, "Hey man, you're looking sexy," or something. It was like. It was really fun, By the way, for listeners, there is a fruit and veg market on Portobello Road, so I probably thought you were advertising. Yeah, they used to throw bananas at me when I went down there, that was funny, and so we just started using my head really as a display for my sculptures. So I used to get these big tubes that you used to insulate your pipes, and I used to glue those on with Evo sticks. So I had like these huge dreadlocks hanging off, and the Mickey Mouse sunglasses. Now, this is after punk. It was a sort of...
It's like performance art.
I suppose it is performance art, really.
It's just street performance art. Yeah. Because you become the actual performance just by being out on the street. Yeah. You don't have to do anything, do you? Yeah.
And I think it was kind of these ideas I'd got from Brett, which was pre-punk. And he drew this comic for New Musical Express. And he invented this character called Joe Exile, and he christened me Joe Exile. And so in the punk years, I was called Joe Exile, and, the people started to join me on that. And, and then I had this girl, Justina, called herself the Envy Girl, and she was absolutely stunning girl, like with huge long legs and tiny little mini skirts. And she made a pair of tits out of Citroen headlights, from the Citroen 2CV, like this.
Oh yeah, the ones that move.
Yeah, it's just strapped on, like. And then another friend of mine, Josh Bowler, he started wearing like gas masks with big spikes coming out the eyes, and he was like my bodyguard, and I started to mutate into this eccentric millionaire, and I had all suit rubber skin hanging off my head and all suit clamps like I'd had brain operation. I got this old Victorian postman's three-wheel bicycle, and I put a sidecar on the front of it, and I was just sitting there. And my friend Josh used to pedal me down the Portobello Road like in that. And then another friend of mine, Alan, called him the rock and roll doctor, the Apocalypse Alan they called him. We used to sell plaster skulls, painted all up on the market. But we used to do a funeral procession with a coffin. It was a lot of fun.
Joe, the next stage for you is quite significant, isn't it? Frestonia, a bunch of people squatting in West London declare their area an independent country.
Yeah, exactly.
Here is a sidebar about Frestonia. In the late 1970s, in a small triangle of streets just north of Notting Hill, an unlikely experiment in alternative living briefly declared itself a sovereign state, the free and independent Republic of Frestonia. And for a few strange creative years, it became one of the most curious political, countercultural footnotes in the history of London. The story began in the early 70s in the area around Freston Road and Bramley Road. It's North Kensington, we would call it now. Many Victorian terraced houses had been emptied by the council and left to decay. Residents had been moved into new concrete tower blocks nearby, and the authorities planned to demolish the old streets. That was going around the city and probably around the country. But the demolition was delayed, probably for financial reasons, and the empty houses became an irresistible opportunity. Squatters began moving in around 1974, and it was a proper mixed bunch: artists, musicians, activists, travellers, young families, and people simply looking for somewhere affordable to live. Joe amongst them. The houses were in poor condition, and residents often had to improvise basic services, running electricity cables between buildings, patching leaking roofs, sharing food and resources. But what emerged in those neglected streets was something rare, a functioning community built from the ground up. By the middle of the decade, there was about 120 people living there, and the atmosphere was bohemian, experimental. Communal childcare arrangements were set up, food co-ops appeared, political meetings took place alongside parties, performances and art projects. I mean, for some, it was simply cheap housing, but for others it was an attempt to build a new kind of society. Cooperative, creative, countercultural. But then in 1977, the Greater London Council announced plans to clear the area and evict the squatters. Facing the prospect of being homeless and dispersed across the city, the residents devised an unusual strategy. If they became a country, perhaps eviction would become a diplomatic problem. So on Halloween 1977, they declared independence. Now, for sure, that was a partly serious protest and partly theatrical satire. It was inspired by the Ealing comedy film from the 50s, Passport to Pimlico. Pimlico is a little area in London near Victoria, and in the film, the residents declare themselves an independent state, inspiring the residents of Frestonia, who designed a flag, issued postage stamps and passport visas, even formed a government. The dwarf actor David Rappaport served as foreign minister, while playwright Heathcote Williams acted as ambassador to the United Kingdom. They even wrote to the United Nations, requesting recognition and a peacekeeping force. It worked brilliantly as publicity. International journalists descended on the streets, fascinated by this tiny breakaway republic in West London. So what could easily have been treated as a squatting dispute instead became a global media curiosity, a witty protest that embarrassed the local authorities and forced them to negotiate. Inside Frestonia, life took on an increasingly imaginative character. There was a newspaper, the Tribal Messenger. There was an art space where Joe exhibited, the Carbreaker Gallery, and various performances and events, and visitors could have their passports stamped at the border. Even the practical politics of survival had a sense of theatre. At one point, the residents adopted the same surname, Bramley, so they could legally claim to be one extended family, which would make it harder for authorities to split them up. Eventually, the standoff softened into compromise. By the early 80s, many residents were working with the Notting Hill Housing Trust to establish the Bramley Housing Co-op. New housing was built, allowing a number of the original residents to remain. The physical republic disappeared, but the story of Frestonia still resonates as a moment when humour, creativity, theatre, collective action briefly transformed a housing struggle into a kind of living performance, a tiny utopian experiment that asked playfully what a different society might look like.
The hippies moved in there. It was half knocked down by the time they got in there, so one whole street was gone in the back, and that became this sort of utopian garden with like little waterfalls, and everyone shared the garden, corrugated iron all around it, fence all around it. And then these little houses that they turned into lesbian centres and a law centre and macrobiotic food, and and then there was a house just full of alcoholics. All sorts of people gathered there. It was quite progressive, really, but very much a hippie sort of utopian dream. But then on the other side of the road, there was two scrapyards, just dragging in cars and tearing cars apart, and there was a pub which was most likely to be full of gangsters in London at the time, called the Bramley Arms. And the road, Branbury Road, was at right between Shepherd's Bush and Notting Hill police stations, catchment areas. So both of them decided it was the other person's problem. So it was a completely lawless area, which is a good and bad thing, And it's kind of cut off, because it's cut off with the link road between the Shepherd's Bush roundabout and the big area roundabout on the A40s. This situation sort of went on, and it was kind of passport to Pimlico, and everyone thought it was really funny, and the press covered it.
You got a huge amount of press, didn't it? Around the world, actually.
Yeah.
People were like, sort of in love with the story, right?
Yeah, people loved the idea of it. And it kind of carried on until the somebody in the the local government said, well, hang on a minute, if this is an independent country, then how can these people be getting social security and the dole from us? We don't have to give them the dole. So they cut off all their benefit payments. And the next day, all the barriers were down. Things went back to normal.
Were you aware of all this? Because you were further over towards Portobello.
I think we probably used to go down in school or something, but I kind of knew it. But then my friend Alan, he went down there and basically took over one little house in Bramley Road, which he christened the Apocalypse Hotel, and he just painted this big sign on it, Apocalypse Hotel. And this was a little punk nightmare set up in the middle of the hippie dream. And the rest of my little crew, we were called the Chaos Brothers, we all moved down there. That when we had parties in there, literally bricks would bounce out the front of the building and land on the pavement, and the floor would be moving up and down, like just with all people dancing. Alan, really, me and him started working together as artists, and we just started repainting the front of the street and the front of the building and hanging things on it. Police were always coming around because we were stealing the electricity. They'd be banging on the front door.
Because you said there's a scrapyard there as well, right? So were you getting stuff from the scrapyard?
Yeah. You didn't really need it because people were fly tipping down there, so people would just come down in the night and boom, and next thing there would be a huge pile of old car tyres or old fridges or all sorts of stuff, So there was loads of old bomb sites still in Shepherd's Bush. So there was loads and loads of places to scavenge. And so really, the Pockets Hotel in a lot of ways was really kind of very, very early street art. I think there was a bit of acid going on in those days as well.
We haven't talked about that. Let's tick that box off. So where were you with the drug stuff? Punk was lots of speed and stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, a lot of speed, a lot of French blues they called them. Drugs were everywhere in those days.
You were a smoker, right?
I smoked, but I stopped enjoying the effect of hash really early. When we were young, we used to smoke it and laugh and make stupid food and and all that. But then after a bit, it just depressed me and it made me feel sort of weird and paranoid. And I think it actually did me quite a lot of damage. I had a bit of a breakdown eventually. And I think it was more to do with hash than any other drug.
When was that?
That was kind of towards the end of the Apocalypse Hotel period, so I was maybe 18 time.
There's a window, I think, particularly for young men, apparently, between about 17 and 22, when I think it's much worse now with skunk, but just for some reason at that time, because of brain formation and stuff, when it can have quite a nasty effect on them.
I think so. And I took acid, so there's a lot of these little orange microdots around.
Did you do microdot?
Again, didn't really get on with acid because I couldn't relax and just let it be trippy. I kind of had to fight it. I had to be in control. There was bits of fun in it. I couldn't just relax into a trip.
Like go and float downstream, as John Lennon says.
No, I'm not a floater really, And there was a lot of smack, but I never touched smack. And the reason I never touched smack was my mother was in art school, in St Martin's Art School. The first wave of smack arrived when she was a student, and no one really even knew what it was about. She sat us down and she said, "Look, children, there's this thing called heroin, and you never touch it." She didn't even explain what it was very well, but I could see the fear in her eyes, and about it, and so I never touched it.
You see a lot of damage to people around you.
Honestly, the amount of people I wouldn't count them because I wouldn't dishonour them to number them, but I lost so many friends through heroin, and just watch people just disappear. Just good people found in toilets, found in dead in their car with their cigarette burned right through their fingers,
And just a lot of people destroyed by it, even if they didn't die as well, right? And havoc on families.
Yeah, and the antithesis of what I was trying to do, the antithesis, the exact opposite to creativity, exact opposite to things that spiral outwards and upwards, is something that spirals inwards and downwards,
Well, it's the opposite of freedom in a way, isn't it? Where you become caged inside this little bubble of need.
Totally, and the thing also what happened to me was I was out on the road one time and I got a really, really bad toothache. And I was up in the Midlands and these lads knew this. They knew this local chemist who still made this laudanum tincture, so they went and got it. And I went from this agonising pain to, floating on these little fluffy clouds in the sunshine, and when I finished that, I thought,
That's dangerous.
no, that's too likeable.
Yeah.
And also, I kind of feel that's where you go when you die. I think when you finally part with your body, I think that's what's waiting for you. So, to me, that whole heroin thing is like playing with death,
So that was part of the scene you were around, but you weren't partaking in it because actually your main focus was still on making things, isn't it? And
I can't make stuff even when I'm stoned, By this time I had a little studio in an old undertaker's long building where they used to lay out the corpses, and for the undertakers.
Was that the first move you made sort of into sort of going out and acknowledging the fact that I'm an artist and I'm going to, make this my thing?
I think so, yeah. So I'd go and work on a film job, and I'd work there maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Then I'd have a whack of money and be raring to go do something interesting or some of my own stuff. You're building beautiful stuff for the adverts, but it was to advertise a rich tea biscuit or advertise, a watch, or you all knew that you were taking it up the arse a bit. It was great to then get in the studio. So if I'd worked 3 weeks, I could live for 3 weeks in my own studio.
Right.
And so I just started building, working all night. And I couldn't do it when I was stoned, because if I was stoned, I would rush from one idea to the other. My head would get so excited and overstimulated imagination. So the only thing I can really work on is tea creatively. And people seem to think, because I do such mad sculptural stuff, that I must be taking drugs to do it.
How did you move from there to your first show in the Frestonia Gallery, right?
Yeah, so that was next door to the Apocalypse Hotel. And it was a sort of group show. The hippies brought over those things, and my friend Frank brought out mandalas that he did, and everyone bought a little thing. We put it in there, and I put a couple of sculptures in there that I just started. But I didn't really do a lot of galleries for years and years after that. So what I did was, in that studio in Shepherd's Bush, I built an exhibition, and I went out and advertised it, and I had an opening, and a lot of people came down for the opening. But then the rest of the time, I was just sitting there with no one coming, So I decided, actually, rather than do my art and try and get people to it, what I was going to do was I was going to do my art and take it to people.
Right.
It was really the start of just turning up on the Portobello Road with all these things I built and cycling them or towing them or driving them up and down the roads, and
take the art to the people.
Take it to them. And people, when they come to an art gallery, are kind of expecting to see art, but people who've gone out to get their shopping aren't expecting to see a chopped up Volkswagen Beetle with lorry wheels on it coming past.
I mean, half the time I don't know what to do when I go to a gallery. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a strange thing, isn't it? I mean, it can be amazing, of course, but I always feel a bit puzzled, about how to respond somehow.
Thing is, if you put anything into a completely white antiseptic environment, then it's going to be the focus of attention, and you could put a dog turd on a plinth in a white environment and everyone will be looking at that dog turd,
Yeah, and trying to work out how to respond to it.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're out in the street, you're actually making stuff, so you're wearing stuff and you're with your friends. This has been like a part of what you do since, isn't it? That you could call it performance art, you could call it theatre, street theatre in a way. It's all mixed up together, isn't it?
It is. I think after the Apocalypse eventually got knocked down, I was living in a basement just off Ladbroke Grove, and I came up one night with the idea of this thing, Mutoid Waste Company. I decided that a mutoid was a person who lives in a state of constant mutation, constant change, and nothing in their world ever stayed the same. They would move different places, so everything they looked out the window would be different every day, and clothes they wear would be different. Person who, instead of trying to fight change, which is really what a lot of our lives is about, or trying to defend ourselves against change, like by accumulating money and that, it would be a person who finds security in knowing that they can constantly adapt to whatever changes appear. They could just roll with it.
You said we're mutating all the time. If you don't mutate, you're dead.
Absolutely. A mutation is the essence that drives the whole planet. The mutation of creatures, of species, of fauna and flora are always driven by this creative, mutated energy that just makes things develop and thrive and grow. that's what we're tapping into.
We are changing all the time, aren't we? What you just said sort of landed a bit because, I mean, okay, we need to survive. You can see how acquiring stuff is a sort of attempt somehow to deny that, you know, to sort of build a little defence against change, but you can't, really.
One of the things is this huge dichotomy in the human race where we stop being pastoral, travelling people, and we started to become farmers and using agriculture and not moving really. And pastoral people, you know, and they were out all the time. They didn't really feel like they didn't put walls up. They just literally moved from there to there at different times. And then come the summer when everything was easy, they would all come down and all get together, and boys and girls would get together, and the boys would fight, and the men would trade, and the women would gossip. And this is really a very human thing, and it's what the festival is really. You know, it's the memory of this travelling people's moments where we get together, all come from our different journeys.
You know, the guy who wrote that book Sapiens, which is this sort of history of the human race, he says that in many ways the agricultural revolution, which is the shift from being nomadic to actually being farmers, was the biggest catastrophe for the planet that there's ever been. He's talking ecologically. I mean, obviously you can make lots of other arguments about culture and consciousness and all. Well, actually he was talking about two things. He said it ecologically for the planet, but also how human beings became a lot less healthy. And then when you've got people in one place, then you get the rise of an elite.
Yeah. And also, once you've claimed a place, you then
have to defend it.
You have to defend it.
Fences go up. You get this idea of territory. So all this is floating around in your mind. How did it crystallise into Mutoid Waste Company?
What I told you before was that, I had this breakdown. I think it was just too much rough living and too much drugs, and just had this complete crash.
What was it like?
I just became unable to communicate with people, and I just became totally horror struck by all the social norms. And, somebody started talking to me and asking me what birth sign I was. I would just break out in a sweat. I think I'd been on the road too long as well by that point, maybe. But I'm a charismatic person, and it's not a boast. It's some people have it and some people don't. It's not a mark of whether you're a good person or not. It's just how you are. And I was projecting pure static, pure confusion and pure tension. And if I went into a pub, the whole pub was kind of go silent and just look at me because I was just giving out this sort of static. And I kind of realised I had to get away from the Apocalypse Hotel, and I had to get away from all my mates who probably were viewing their life as this wild moment, and then a lot of them just went and got on with straight things. I knew it's for life for me. And so in the middle of winter, I got this huge box, put all these bits of motorbike and pieces I've been collecting, and found some skis, and I put them underneath the box, and I pushed it in the snow from the Apocalypse Hotel right round to this squat on Blenheim Crescent. I kind of just started building things, but I was still in this really depressed thing. But I had this girlfriend, I'd met this girl, I'd be sitting, I wouldn't, in total silence, and she'd just come and just talk and natter and tell me about her mother and her friends and what had happened and what the neighbour had said and all this, and just fool me out, and then we'd have a brilliant weekend, then I'd slide back into my hole again. But then I started creating, and I started making this stuff. And then one day I had this old motorbike, and I had this helmet, which was one of the first things I'd ever made, which was this sort of futuristic mutant helmet. And I thought, actually, you know what, I'm a Sagittarian, so the idea of the Sagittarian is it's a centaur, half man, half horse, And I looked at the motorbike and I thought, I could make this motorbike into a centaur and use that head. But then I thought, I want to make it like it's coming out of the bike. I started to substitute the arm muscles for shock absorbers and springs, and the chest was a petrol tank of a bike. And I spent the whole winter doing it in this haunted little building in Wandsworth. Too scared to go out the door because it was so haunted, this place.
Haunted by
some Victorian character. Nobody wanted to live in it, so these builders used it as their office, and even they were terrified of it. It was wrong, But anyway, I spent the whole winter in there sawing. I had an arm like a lobster by the end of it, from hacksawing through great big lumps of metal. But I built this character, taught myself to weld, found myself on a bus one day laughing. And it'd been so long since I'd laughed, and it was like, just like I was out of prison, And I realised that it was a creativity, that what I was doing, that I was creating, had freed me. So kind of what I felt I wanted to do was show people, don't have to be an artist, just find stuff and make something out of it. Doesn't matter if it's good, doesn't matter if it's bad, just do it.
We're going to pause there But we will return to hear the further extraordinary adventures of Joe and the mad world of Mutoid Waste in part 2. I love this story. Like several of my guests over the years, not just artists, and you know, in a way, maybe all of us, you can see the signposts along the way that led to who they became, but only by looking back. They're not apparent at the time. And in Joe's case, you know, his father's inventiveness, his mum's creativity, and his childhood, you know, moving from place to place. 2000 AD, the comic Punk, being taken on by a set builder, you know, the West London Counterculture, and most poignantly, I think, finding creativity as a route out of the dark night of the soul back into the wide world and community. All these things helping to form who he became and what he did. As I mentioned, if you're listening in March 2026, Joe's latest exhibition, Unnatural, is opening at the Bomb Factory in London. There's a link to that in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Kate, Richard, Scott, Lisa, Valentina and Jessica for their thoughts and appreciation. Thanks in particular to my friend Will Wilds, who suggested this conversation and connected me with Joe. Thanks, Will. Let's finish with a tune from the Real Tuesday World, appropriately from an upcoming album called Junk Shop Melodies. And I will meet you further down the road, round the bend, and over the scrap heap for more of these tales from the other side.